So, welcome again, everyone. As you saw, we were working with some different issues within the Hangout, but we are ready to get going again, and we're excited that you're here. You've made it to the halfway point of this virtual round of applause is in order. Congratulations. And for me, today has really been a day of enlightenment and excitement. The conversations, the panelists, the keynotes have all been just phenomenal, and it's only going to get better. I'm excited that you're tuning into this panel on Makerspaces. In a 21st century landscape, creativity, design, and engineering are making their way to the forefront of educational considerations as tools such as 3D printers, robotics, and 3D modeling web-based applications become more accessible within Makerspaces. Our panelists have worked in various forms of Makerspaces in their work environment and its implications for the museums of the future. This topic resonates heavily with me personally within my work with the K-12 schools, because schools are actually looking at museums and trying to unpack how you all are working with teaching and learning to actually bring it back to where they're at. So you are the trendsetters for this topic, and especially these panelists, they have some really interesting things to share. Don't forget to utilize that chat on here. I see many of you have been, and also social media. We're on Twitter. We've got hashtags for each of the different panelists. So we want to hear from you. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce each speaker and let them talk to you about their background and how they define and use Makerspaces within their environment. So the first person is Rebecca Grabman, Make Shop Manager and the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh.
Hello everyone, my name is Rebecca and I manage Make Shop, which is an exhibit within Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. So we are a permanent exhibit within a museum that's geared towards young children and families. And actually the original inception of Make Shop was partially in an effort to get older children into the museum. We had about 30% of our audience was above the age of 7. But there wasn't anything that was specifically for them. So the original concept of Make Shop was this area where an older child could come in and engage in the museum in a more in-depth and long-term way where their siblings, younger siblings, might not have that stamina to be in an exhibit for that long. Well, we quickly discovered that really all ages wanted to be in the space. So that's been something that we've really focused on is the young child and working in a family informal environment. So with that in mind, because we're working with, in some cases, very young children, sort of defining making for ourselves in a way that doesn't necessarily encompass all of the things that you may think of when you think of, oh, this is what a makerspace is. And we really try to identify different principles and dispositional things that come out of making, like exploring and questioning, tinkering, sharing resources, expressing intention. They're at the heart of all kinds of making, and then finding different ways to pull those out using different disciplines. That's kind of how we approach what we do here.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next, I want to take it over to Elizabeth Merritt, the founder and director of the Center for Future for Museums at the American.
Hi. I'm very pleased to join you today. I'm sort of an outlier in this presentation because I don't run a makerspace. I am a futurist and I spend a lot of time reading and talking to people about what they're doing in museums, and makerspaces fit firmly into a trend that we've been seeing over the 8-year arc that CFM has been in existence, which is the trend of people adapting things to be part of their culture, what we call the my culture trend. We see people wanting more participatory experiences. We see people wanting to really get their hands on and do as well as view. So I'm defining makerspaces in a really broad way, which is as places that instead of being delivery mechanisms, like, say, a book, or in our case, exhibits, are platforms and laboratories. So it's like giving somebody a typewriter and access to a reference library instead of giving them the pre-written book. I think they also represent a shift in museums from us as professors who are teaching people specific points that we think they ought to know, to being more like a shop teacher who gives them access to resources and encourages them to make their own stuff. And last of all, I think it marks a shift from museums as arbiters of what's important and what people ought to be experiencing to museums as facilitators. So we're providing the access, we're providing support, we're providing training, but we're letting people run on their own. So that, to me, in a very broad sense, is the movement within which these specific makerspaces you're going to hear about today have evolved.
Yeah, so like you were just saying about being more like a shop teacher, I mean, I think that it resonates very much in the fact that we're doing woodworking right now. So for us, again, when we talk about making for young children in this day and age, and even for slightly older children, for school-age children, that's not something that a lot of kids have access to. And so I know that some of the things that we were going to talk about today have a lot to do with schools and learning. And we work a lot with schools, and we've discovered a big trend with the schools we work with that they're curious about project-based learning and hands-on learning, because a lot of them have cut those kinds of programs like SHOP, but they want to bring those things of not just being a distributor, but being a participant and a co-learner. And that's something that we really value and strive for in the kinds of activities that we design for and the ways in which we facilitate, is not just when we work with classrooms of having a teacher be a co-learner with the students, but of having families and intergenerational learning be really collaborative, that people will come in and have no idea how to use, you know, maybe a new technology like a 3D printer or something that's very technical, but they also may come in and not have ever used a sewing machine, not have ever used a saw or a hammer. Even adults come in not knowing that or knowing how to do it incorrectly. And so positioning people where it's about sharing. It's about sharing knowledge and sharing experiences and using each other to further ideas or skills in some way. So that's something that we really are interested in, is how people collaborate and function as a whole. So I think in a museum context, that's really interesting, that we're not posting a lot of signage. We actually have pretty minimal signage in our space because we want people to just kind of figure it out. So in terms of the way that people are interacting with the museum, I think it really does change a lot about the environment and a lot about the ways that people perceive it as a space and what's possible and what's expected of them, just because of those simple cues like signage or like instructions. That some people are very disturbed by that. They come in and they expect to be told that they're in a cultural institution and this is the culture they're supposed to be getting, and that's how you do it. And it's confusing and weird to them.
But important, because I think one of the cool things about makerspaces is that they're promoting self-directed learning and forcing people to figure it out for themselves, which in some ways is very much part of our technological culture. You give a 6-year-old or a 9-year-old kid a piece of electronics and they just whack away until they figure it out. They're not inhibited about whether they're getting it right, and they certainly don't read the instruction manual. Those are the kinds of learning skills that we're hearing when we talk to people about the future of the workforce and the future of how education and lifelong learning are going to take place. They say that that's one of the things that was lacking from 20th century education, is promoting a kind of learning mindset that brings people to the table with a bunch of stuff and says, figure it out yourself, instead of waiting for the instructions or assuming there's a right answer. So I think that's one reason it's one of the most important kinds of learning spaces that we're providing in museums today. So Rebecca, I was laughing when you were talking about the saw, because we're here in a technology conference, and when we first said makerspaces, I was thinking, ooh, digital fabrication, 3D printers. But I was at the Magic House, which is a children's museum in St. Louis, the other day, and I visited their new makerspace. And one of the things they had lined up were 3 sewing machines, which cracked me up, because it never occurred to me that that would be in a makerspace. But sure enough, and not only that, but they said, I said, well, does this end up being gendered? Do the little boys gravitate towards the cube robots and the little girls run straight to the sewing machines? And they said no, because they don't know what they are. They don't look at them and say, oh, that's a sewing machine, that's girls' work. It's another piece of technology that's thrown out there in the makerspace, and they figure out how to use it just like they figure out how to use the 3D printer or figure out how to use the robot cubes. So I think it's nice, because sort of with a clean slate, kids can come to this to this whole suite of fabrication devices without any assumptions about how they got used and by whom in the past. It just becomes part of their new set of technological tools.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Rebecca. We're just now joined with Mariano. Looks like your video is working, Mariano. So what we're doing is going through and doing introductions and talking about how do you define a makerspace in your area. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Mariano.
First, can you hear me? I'm having some trouble on this end.
No, hear you fine.
Okay, good. So yeah, I am the director of Parachute Factory. We're a community space here in rural northern New Mexico. We're in Las Vegas, New Mexico, about an hour north of Santa Fe. And you know, we define makerspaces in not in terms of our space or the spaces we work in, but more the types of things we do. We work with museums, we work with libraries, we work in community with universities. We're kind of all over the place. So coming up with a really simple description of, you know, a makerspace is a collection of tools or something like that really doesn't work for us and what we're doing. So we like to think about it as the kind of inspiration that it provokes in the people that participate in the kind of workshops we do. So this summer we're working mostly with libraries. We're traveling all around the state doing sort of pop-up makerspace events in really rural libraries all around the state. And these are kind of one-off events. So we're introducing some programs to people usually for the first time. They haven't heard of a makerspace or seen a lot of these kind of tools. And so we get to kind of reintroduce the concept every day to a new crowd. And what it's about is really about making things. I guess that's a simplified way of talking about it. But that's where we're at.
Thanks, Mariano. And so our next question is why is this important for teaching and learning? So we like bringing it back to the Horizon Report. And so I'll give it back to Rebecca. How do you feel that the maker spaces are important for teaching and learning in your space?
Well, we were just kind of jamming on that a little bit, but I think that as a museum that provides opportunities for kids to get out of their classroom, I think having this very different type of experience is something that's really been of interest in our community as a place to visit. So when field trips come, there's definitely an interest in experiencing some of these things that can be very difficult or perceived as very difficult to do in a classroom. So things that require specific technologies or a lot of tools or materials. That's something that we're able to provide either in our space or for people to come to us. And so not only is it just a new opportunity, but because of the framework of the museum as a place that is more informal, it also allows a different way of thinking. We have a lot of school partnerships. We're actually working with a whole school district right now who's trying to go in a project-based and making curriculum for their entire 6 through 12 experience. So that's like one, and it's really really embrace this idea of all these things we're talking about valuing. But we also have been working with some kindergarten classes, and for them, this idea of taking time and noticing and being process-oriented is so different than the way that they kind of have to do the rest of their studies that are oriented towards specific outcomes, specific goals, and to taking tests. That even these kindergartners don't get a lot of opportunity to experiment and explore and test and iterate and to communicate in this different kind of way and be innovative. That allowing them the space and the tools and the opportunity is something that I think we think is very important. We've also found that our local educational community has really embraced that and risen to this and wants this.
Great. How about you, Elizabeth? Taking it back to you. You know, you've been observing this trend as a futurist and as somebody who's experimented with some of the tools like 3D printing and things like that. How do you see this makerspace activities fitting into the larger landscape of where learning and education is headed?
Well, one of the things we've been working on is looking at the forecasting that's being done by organizations like KnowledgeWorks and the Institute for the Future about the future of education generally, and what are the characteristics of the kind of learning landscape that we're going to create in the 21st century. And you've already hit a number of the keywords that come up again and again. So, for example, blended learning. Not saying this is science and this is art and this is English, but finding ways of teaching that get out of those subject-specific tags to just say it's about learning all sorts of things. This is an entree, but it's going to lead to all those places eventually. Self-directed learning, having something that's so fun and engaging that kids grab onto it and just take off. And we say kids, but a lot of what we're saying right now applies to adults too. Immersive and experiential, so that it's not just learning through one modality, whether it's listening to somebody or reading something, but really getting the sort of hands-on kinesthetic feedback that works better for some people. It has very specific niche applications right now. A lot of people are citing research that is beginning to say kids who have attention deficit disorder and don't do well in traditional classrooms can perform quite well in settings like Maker Labs, where they actually have the opportunity to do things and stay engaged and active and not have to sit still and just listen or report out in a writing and be constrained to a test. But I think the other thing that's really important for it as for museums as a learning platform is that it is not the traditional way that people expect to learn from. So by presenting this as a learning opportunity, we're expanding people's visions of what museums are and what we do, and giving them a much broader view of the kind of access we can provide to resources, and changes their conception of what we are. Right now, people are thinking very differently about libraries. They're not just places to go check out books. They're places that you go to get job skills and to search for jobs and to get free tech training. And I think that museums similarly have to push the boundaries of the definitions of what we are so that people appreciate us more.
Well, thanks, Elizabeth. Now, a lot of the activities that we do within museums, we're interested in this idea of assessment. So how do we assess the effectiveness of these activities in our space, Rebecca? I know that you're probably asked that question, or you have to come up with some metrics, some quantitative or qualitative ways of describing what's happening in these maker spaces. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure. It's such a intense question, and there's so much baggage with that idea of how do you assess something that is so it's so difficult to assess, especially when you're focusing on the process and on these things that are not testable, that are dispositional, or that are about like a culture and environment. So in terms of how do we assess within the museum, there's sort of a way of assessing, which is just how long do people spend, and by that measure, I think we've found in our museum, and a lot of other museums have found, that their maker spaces or their tinkering spaces are very popular. Lots of people come into them, lots of people spend time in them, they spend a lot of time. But we are within the Learning and Research Department at our museum, and so we've been looking at a lot of different ways of how do we track these things, and so pinpointing some of these types of engagement, like where by filming kids' experiences and following specific people, where are we seeing different kinds of engagement? So where are we seeing these co-learning experiences, and where are we seeing iteration happening, and how often are these things happening? Where are we seeing this testing and this thoughtfulness, and can we code for that? And that's something that we're working on. We're still figuring out. It's constant. We're constantly doing this, but I don't have a definitive answer for that. One thing that is really interesting, which is happening somewhere over here downstairs right now, actually, is that we are part of an IMLS grant to create a framework for museum and library makerspaces. So there's the convening of researchers happening in our museum this week who are all looking at issues of making, and particularly in an informal context, and trying to talk about what are these things that define a good experience, and see if they can come to some kinds of consensus about what is a good makerspace in a museum, where especially where you don't have a cohort of kids that are coming day after day like you do in a classroom, where at least you can have them keep journals and you can have them keep sketches and they can articulate things. But when you have random people coming in and out, how can you assess the effectiveness of that? And that's a big question. So that's an ongoing project that we're working on to look into that. Makingandlearning.com is going to have some info eventually. But yeah, in classrooms it is a little different since you can do things like have them catalog the process and then show their learning through using other skills, like you were talking about the blended learning of them writing about it and speaking about it and you know, creating other ways of showing the process or the learning that's happening. But
okay. Before I turn it over to Holly, I just want to finish this question with Elizabeth. In your readings, have you seen any kind of assessment or evaluation programs going on within Makerspaces?
Well, I haven't seen the results, but I've seen some very interesting questions and approaches, and one of the things I want to do is broaden it from what Rebecca was talking about, which was specifically oriented towards children, to more broadly makerspaces that may be aimed at adults. One of the really interesting questions is, by offering a makerspace, does a museum broaden the demographic profile of the people who come and use the museum? So studying the demographics of people who choose to come and use the makerspace as opposed to people who use the rest of the museum, or the specific use profile of people who spend more time in the makerspace as compared to people who are using the museum in more traditional ways. Because one of the arguments has been for having makerspaces aimed at young adults or older adults is that it provides a way of interacting that could bring in people who don't relate to the traditional museum exhibit. So that's one question, is that working? And the second thing is, if you're trying to measure outcomes for adults, some of the things that we've been told over and over again, for example, by IMLS, Rebecca, are if you're measuring classic outcomes, is it changing knowledge, is it changing attitude, is it changing skills, is it changing life condition? And these are all things where if a makerspace is something that becomes a habitual part of someone's community and where they're hanging out and spending time and actually doing some of their work, that's something you could track. Is it changing skills so that people are translating what they've learned and done in a makerspace to something that they're actually doing? They're starting a small business or they're putting it on their resume. Are some museums offering any digital badges for achievements in makerspaces that people are using for their digital resumes that may help them round out their portfolio, documented portfolio of skills? And also, you know, and this is something I'm very interested in, is trying to broaden measurements just from, you know, what people know to also how they feel. So if you look at this whole Happy Museum project of how do you measure the effect we have on people's moods and attitude towards life, again, does making have a different kind of effect on how people feel than just viewing art? So those are the sorts of metrics I'm really interested in looking at and hope that museums will be reporting out on soon.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I'm gonna keep it with you because there's a good question that kind of relates to this trend or this movement of maker spaces. This makers are, it's a very hot topic right now, and the question is, why maker spaces? Why now for museums?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to put this in the context of a question I get a lot as the Alliance's designated futurist. And some museums say to me, well, why should we change? And my answer to them is, absolutely. If you're happy with the audience you're getting and you're getting as many people to come through the front door as you want and you have the financial income to support what you're doing, you don't have to change. You're fine. So, you know, don't come to me and ask me how you should change. But what I'm hearing a lot of museums say is they're not happy with any of those things. They're not getting as many people in the museum as they want. They're not getting the demographics they feel reflect the future audience of their city, and they're not making the money they need to support the work they want to do. Well, in that case, they do have to change. And to do that, they have to observe the changing cultural preferences of their potential audiences, especially the people they're not reaching. And one of the very clearly documented trends is towards this desire for participatory engagement. There are people who would love to get their digital or physical hands on our stuff, but aren't as interested in just looking at the way we want to present it. So this is a huge opportunity both to increase our audience and to bolster our financial base.
How about you, Rebecca? I'm sure there was a time at your museum where there wasn't a maker space or any maker activities. So why now, and why maker spaces at your museum? What do you see as the impetus for that?
Well, I can tell you very specifically in our instance kind of how it came about, which is that the museum's philosophy is to inspire joy, creativity, and curiosity through innovative museum experiences. I can quote it. And so this idea of joy and creativity and curiosity is obviously something that's embodied within this idea of a makerspace. And you know, it is something that was becoming hot when we started, or when we started thinking about it. So this idea of an innovative museum experience, like, it made a lot of sense for us. Our space was also founded actually in a partnership with two university programs, the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon, which is a graduate studies program that's a combined fine art computer science graduate program, and the University of Pittsburgh Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments, which is a research group that studies learning in out-of-school environments. And so it was in a conversation of sort of what's happening, what's next, what's new, when one of the professors, who's a game design professor and runs a game design studio, said, what if you had a space where kids could come and they could make anything? It would be a dream factory. And there were already sort of some occasional programming that, you know, were makery, and so it was just sort of like, yeah, you're right, that is something that fits our mission, and it is enjoyable, and so it was something that fit with the culture that we had and we valued, and, you know, we felt was something that we wanted to continue with. But we also thought that it would be this way maybe to, like, bring older kids in. So for us, that was sort of the driving force for why now. Why did it happen at that point? Was just, it came up in conversation, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, and we prototyped it, and it was a good idea, and so we kept doing it. But something about the kind of like the more general why now that I thought was really interesting is we actually, Yancey Strickler, who's the CEO of Kickstarter, was here the other day, because sometimes these things sort of happen, and it was interesting, it was cool. He came and he spoke at the museum in a little after-hours event, and he was talking about the way in which people use Kickstarter and the way in which that company is founded for people to be able to kind of make the world the way they want it, and to impact reality kind of from the internet, which is something that I'm fascinated by. I think, you know, in the sort of tech world is super interesting. But he talked about just about how people really want to make a mark on something, and that's the cultural mores right now, is that everything people do is they can contribute to in some way, you know. And people talk about this all the time, like everybody's on Twitter, and everybody makes a YouTube video, and everybody does this, and everybody does that, and you post your selfies, and you put it on Facebook, and then you share a little bit of yourself with the rest of the world. And so I think that because museums have historically, especially collections-based museums, been these places where we're taking things that the world has made, and we're giving them to you, that people are now like, but that's so different than the rest of my culture, and I want to give back. I want to be a part of this. Yeah. And I want to present myself to the world as well. And it kind of justifies that in an interesting way, I think. That being a cultural institution, being a museum, it's saying, yes, like, you are important, and you are a part of this, you know, whatever practice it is, if it's a contemporary art museum or if it's a natural history museum, but that you are a part of what makes this important. Which I think, you know, we as people in museums, you know, we need visitors. Of course they're important, but it gives them an agency in being a part of that, which I think is really striking for people, and is also just a really great way to connect with kind of the cultural thing that's happening right now that makes museums relevant.
And sometimes it's the tools. Liz is having some trouble connecting, but Liz Neely was the one that got me really interested in this idea of makerspaces, and really a facet of makerspaces, which is photogrammetry or 3D scanning inside of a museum space. She really specialized with that at the Art Institute of Chicago, and got me really interested after I went to a Museum Computer Network conference and saw a couple sessions with her and some of her colleagues from New Mexico. But it's that idea of, you know, I come from, I was an education curator, education director, and always wanting to get people to slow down and look carefully at artworks and objects, and that is one way to do so, is using technology, and it was a free app that was able to use on a tablet, and basically it's you know, it's also part of this instant gratification thing too. So within a matter of minutes, I was able to take a sculptural object using Autodesk's 123D Catch, which is a free app. Take a number of, about 20 or so images around around the object, and then send it up to the cloud so that it could get stitched together into this 3D virtual object, this visualization. And for me, when I learned about that, I went to my office and I just took an object on my table and started taking some images, and boom, within 10 minutes from taking those images, I was able to get my 3D visualization and be able to look at it from every angle, and all of a sudden that thing that you might have walked past on a pedestal or in a vitrine or in an area that may have not, you're starting to look at it in different ways. You're like, oh, let's look at these textures. This might make a good 3D visualization. And so that, for me, it was getting audiences to kind of slow down, and that's a great activity. And it's there's also the 3D printing component of it. I mean, you could take that scan and take it into an area where you could actually create meshes over that 3D visualization, and then actually print out that object that you scanned. Usually it would be a much smaller object, but still, that was the payoff for me as somebody who was just interested in learning that technology, is being able to take these aspects of Makerspace. I wasn't physically making anything, but what I was doing was using some of the tools that you would use within a making environment to scan an object and start understanding it in a different way. So there are aspects of Makerspaces that are making in a digital way. I see that we have Mariano back. Mariano has worked in several different types of places, like he said, libraries, community centers, museums. So I want to kick this question to Mariano, since we're focused specifically on museums. Why Makerspaces? Why now for museums? Why do you see museums being so interested in getting involved in Makerspaces or working with you at the Parachute Factory?
I think one thing that museums have that say our just community makerspace doesn't so much is content. Some really interesting things to work with. So activities can be built around collections and pieces from the museum, and it just elevates it from maybe a skill building activity to something with actual substance, and gives some motivation for picking up some of those skills. And I think right now, just with the accessibility of the tools, we're seeing that it really is the right time. We participate every year in MCN, the Museum Computer Network, and we try to do things with some of the latest tools, but we try to keep it really kind of bootstrap and show museums what can be done with very little, as far as equipment goes, and time and resources and everything. So I think it's really a combination of things, not least of which is just the accessibility of a lot of these tools, how cheap and widely available they become, and how exciting they can be. The kind of stuff we do. We talk about it like it's magic, right? We show all of these really cool tools and toys we can play with, and they're exciting. But then the real fun is in kind of debunking them and going through how they work. So I may have lost you guys. I'm not sure if.
No, I still hear you.
Okay,
and see you.
Cool.
So we're getting close to the end of our program. So I want to start winding it down and talk about kind of the future directions for these types of things. And I'll leave it with you, Mariano. So what do you think the future holds for Makerspaces? This is something that has popped up and has gathered a lot of steam and momentum. Where do we see this 10, 20 years from now? If you're looking at the Parachute Factory and thinking about strategically, what is your vision for 10 years down the road for your organization and for your integration into some of these learning centers?
Yeah. It's a really important question, and there's a few distinctions that I think we're just starting to make now. There's this whole end of Makerspaces that is really about business, about training people to be entrepreneurs and manufacturers and things like that. And it seems to be that in the bigger end of what people are looking at when they see Makerspaces, that's what they're thinking of. Our space is really totally different. We really are not focused on those things. We're not trying to help people put together the next $5 million Kickstarter project or whatever. But we're really about education and empowerment for particularly young people. So for us and for the bigger maker movement, I see it going into formal education as well as informal education. The things that we're doing now with museums and libraries are showing that this is a really valid way of teaching and learning, and it's a refreshing way. And so it's my personal thing is I want to.
Oh, we lost that personal thing. Oh, well, maybe we can have him, Mariano, catch up with that personal last nugget of information in a moment. But I'll go ahead and bring it back to Rebecca. Okay, so what do you think the future holds for Makerspaces? How do you see your space changing, or just the field changing in the next 20 years, 10, 20 years?
Well, I think with us personally, since we are in a children's museum, but we've discovered that even adults really like to come without kids and play in our space. So, like, for example, we started having 21 plus nights where we allow adults to play and drink in our museum. Because of that, I think we've just discovered that that there's an interest in it, and we're going to continue to expand our programming and our offering. And there's a long-term plan to take over. There's an abandoned building next to us, or that needs some work done before it can be inhabited, but we're talking about creating a community space that would actually involve a larger version of Make Shop that would be oriented towards youth and adults. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot just in terms of our community, is that the museum is working with an artist right now who grew up in this neighborhood. Our museum lives on the north side of Pittsburgh, which is not a really well-off neighborhood, and according to this artist who's getting together this project, the neighborhood used to have a lot of community feeling for it because a lot of the people attended the same churches, they grew up in the same neighborhood, they all went to school in the same neighborhood, but with people coming in and out and the magnet schools drawing people from different areas and people no longer kind of having that same association and no longer having like the church communities that they used to, there's a lack of community feeling. But something that makerspaces outside of museums have a lot of is really amazing, rich experiences where people are meeting other people, it's meeting in the minds, and they're working together and they're collaborating, they're really creating community. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for museums to become community spaces because of these kinds of offerings and activities. The way in which libraries have always sort of been. I think that's another reason why libraries are very interested in this, is because it's just another way to create a space that people can come together. So I know that we're kind of trying to help our community in that way, providing this as almost a community space and growing it in sort of in that direction. But I think that it's there are opportunities for museums to be not just a special place that you visit when you want to see a collection, but that you go to engage with other people, which may be the case in some museums, but it is not traditionally why people go to museums. So I think that's a really interesting possible trajectory or opportunity.
Oh, that's a great point. It may encourage more people to go to museums who may not be interested in maybe some of the other things that museums have to offer, but being a resource and a place to experiment and play and being able to build things.
And then hopefully they can get hooked into the rest of the museum.
Yes, get those hooks in. Okay, lastly, turn it over to Elizabeth. What do you see the future holding for Makerspace? What do you see 10 to 20 years from now as a museum futurist?
Well, for one thing, I really liked everything Rebecca had to say, so I'm just going to build on that and take it as a given that I agree with all of the pictures she painted. I've got a sort of small, medium, and big projection. Not short, medium, and long term, but small, medium, and big in terms of the effect this could have on museums. And the small impact is, I think, makerspaces per se, whatever we call them, could become a more and more common feature that a lot of museums have. So some museums have shops, some museums don't. Some museums have cafes, some museums don't. Not that many museums have makerspaces right now. It could become more common. That's the sort of smallest and least interesting part of the trend. The medium one, which starts to get more interesting, is remember this is part of the growth of a bigger ecology of makerspaces. Not all of them, obviously, are in museums. And I think that ecology of makerspaces is going to change the way that museums behave, because whether or not we have our own places we're providing where people can get their hands on our physical or digital stuff and do things related to our content, we could be it's an and or an or, push out our information, especially digital content, to other makerspaces. So it gives us another way to interface with the bigger world and make what we have available to other people to use in different ways. So it gives us another way to become part of a larger ecology of making. So that's the medium one. And then the biggest one builds on something that Jasper Visser said in his keynote, and I took notes on it, so I'm just peeking at that. Jasper noted that he said that the Rijksmuseum's website isn't just a website, it's a way of working. So by creating this website where there were open resources, where the museum said, don't just look at our digital content, take it, use it, make money from it, do anything with it, make it into a tattoo, plaster it on your car. It really changed the whole culture and psychology of how the museum worked. And I think that makerspaces have the potential to create a similar cultural shift. So it's not just about whether you have a makerspace, but shifting from the basic mindset of presenting the story and showing people your stuff in a static way and being a place where they come to see what you wanted them to see, to creating a whole environment, not just the makerspace, where the philosophy is one of sharing and engagement and providing resources and a place for people to build on, not just the one-way communication that museums have very traditionally in the past seen as their primary mode of operation. So to me, the biggest picture is maker spaces creating a whole cultural and attitudinal shift in how museums operate.
That's a great point, Elizabeth. That's one of the themes that has been emerging today, is this idea of the participatory nature of these topics and movements. Especially with the crowdsourcing, getting people involved with helping to build a collection or an exhibition, or to help fund a project, and this idea of making is coming in and engaging with the museum in a different way and participating in the museum. And I think that's something that we see as a major theme, kind of connecting some of these topics. And with that, I want to, on behalf of the NMC, Holly Ludgate, thank our panelists today, Rebecca Grabman, Elizabeth Merritt, and Mariano, who came in and out, and extend sincerest apologies to Liz Neely for some of the technical issues on bringing her in. We'll make sure to find a way of getting everyone her take on makerspaces. For the next few minutes, we're going to take another break, get our other BYOD panelists in, and so just take a few minutes to stretch your legs, grab some coffee. We'll get started in about 10 minutes. See y'all soon.